Hi, and welcome to a session on the growing phenomenon that is stay interviews. So, what is a stay interview? Well, it's a structured conversation designed to find out how things are going, what pain points the employee might be experiencing, what motivates them. It's broader than a discussion about projects or performance. It's about getting to what is at the root of an employee's decision to remain in a job and what makes them fulfilled. Stay interviews are designed to engage employees before they become dissatisfied. So rather than just waiting until you do the exit interview, you're doing it much earlier in the employee life cycle. They're a way of making sure you're doing everything you can to encourage your employees to stay with you. Not by the normal ways we do it, kind of the golden handcuffs like extensive long service or retirement benefits or retention payments, but by creating an environment that meets their needs. And according to 52% of employees who are leaving companies, they say their manager or organization could have done something to keep them from leaving. Now, even if you take out the ones that you don't want to keep, this is still a big number. So they're worth doing. And we're going to have a look at how to get them going in your organization. Now, to kick things off, it can be useful to have some goals around what you want managers to achieve. For most companies, these goals are around reducing the number of people who leave in their first year, so an early retention goal. Now, if you want to set effective retention goals for your managers, you need to calculate the total amount of turnover costs for that manager, including cost per hire, and estimate some lost productivity, and then set a goal by agreeing an improved retention percentage and time frame for achieving it. Now, these two companies have both set themselves early retention goals. Hilton, they focused on their call centers, and in the call centers, they had a turnover of 55% and above. They managed by working with them to set early retention goals and then putting in plans for stay interviews at both 30 and 90 days. They managed to reduce that turnover by 50% in 4 months. Now, EA Sports, it was fascinating because until they actually looked at their data around early retention and what it was costing them, they didn't actually think they had a problem amongst their now 9,000 employees. But what they did was they formulated monthly retention plans, and a copy of the retention forecast was brought to the monthly exec meeting to identify who was at risk and to find out what they actually had planned to retain them. So you might want to think about setting some early retention goals as a way of contextualizing the stay interview that you're going to introduce. Now, you might also want to target your stay interviews rather than doing it for all employees, which might seem a little bit big or a little bit exhausting or problematic. Have a think about targeting. And this is what these two companies did. So Whirlpool, they target their stay interviews on what they regard as critical people and roles. Now, to get to those critical people and roles, what they did was to assess the impact if an employee should leave. And so they asked their managers a number of questions. If this employee left Whirlpool, is the current business in the current business environment, would we sustain significant revenue loss or increased risk? They asked them, if this employee left Whirlpool, would we lose significant intellectual capital? They asked, is there a weak or non-existent contingency plan if this role were vacant? And finally, would this role be difficult to fill both internally and externally? Now, if managers answered yes to any of these questions, then they had to answer a further 25 questions about the employee. These 25 questions related to the job, the role, their development, the alignment with that job and their career goals, the manager-employee relationship, and the external support system. The reason that they were asking those questions was to really understand the retention risk, but also to understand whether that manager really had a handle on what would encourage that employee to stay. Now, after they'd done the first round of interviews, they kind of assessed with both managers and employees how they felt the stay interview had gone and what they'd found through the process. And a couple of major findings that really surprised them came up. Firstly, managers assessed their relationship with their employees as being much stronger than the employees' assessment. And there were also some engagement factors that were specifically called out by employees as being important to them that had been completely missed by their managers. So things like feeling valued, having meaningful work, being recognized, rewarded, or working with great people, these had been completely missed by their managers. So Whirlpool targeted those employees that were at risk and that were going to be causing them a problem if they left. What LinkedIn did was to target technical talent who were at risk of leaving. So this came about in the spring of 2015, and LinkedIn's technical teams were really struggling. You know, they kind of were, LinkedIn are literally in the shadows of Google and Facebook and some of those other perhaps sexier brands in Silicon Valley. And their competitors were aggressively recruiting engineers. All too often, managers and leaders only learned about the employees' career aspirations when they were headed out the door. So what they did was to work on understanding the flight risk of this group of engineers and to develop plans to make sure that they stayed. They called this the Love Bus Tour. This Love Bus Tour was rooted in both art and science of motivation. What they wanted was that if they could have coordinated conversations with the top engineers to recognize their contributions, understand their aspirations, and then take actions, that they wanted to help those employees kind of feel the love and become more excited about their future at LinkedIn and be less likely to leave. In other words, by proactively having career conversations, they'd have the opportunity to get ahead of a person's decision to leave. Now, they focused on the ones they identified at being at risk of leaving, and they did a number of things with this group. First up, they held an initial workshop for managers where they explained how it's the manager's responsibility to inspire employees to keep contributing at LinkedIn. Attendees to this workshop kind of looked at their own reasons for staying to help them kind of like really connect with their employees and receive some guidance on how to lead these kind of career conversations. Each of the top performer that they'd identified received a personalized card from the head of engineering, thanking them for their contribution to the company. Now, this was a kind of zero cost gesture from a senior leader, but it had real impact. You know, some of the proud recipients even shared images of this recognition on social media. Next up, they facilitated conversations between top performing engineers and senior leaders. And what they wanted to do with these conversations was to have 5 main points covered. These 5 points were, you're on our radar. They wanted to explain their commitment to excellence is getting noticed. Next up, they wanted us to say thank you, to show gratitude for their key contributions. Thirdly, they wanted to say, you're critical to us, to convey their importance to the organization. Fourthly, they wanted to say, my door's open, reminding them that their questions or concerns are always welcome. And finally, talk to me about why you chose LinkedIn and what's keeping you at LinkedIn. Then the talent analytics team and the engineering leadership teams then analyzed the information that they were getting. They aggregated common themes and built talent plans around the engineers. Finally, they invested in training of their senior leaders to help improve the consistency and the quality of conversations. And they did this in a 2-hour session. The first hour introduced managers to cutting-edge research into the neuroscience of engagement and how it relates to career conversations, and the second hour provided the opportunity to role play with peers. Now, this training really worked because it was directly tied to research, it was delivered in a language that engineers could understand, and it was short. It showed them the power they have in these conversations, and this really resonated with them. By the end of 2015, the engineers who had been part of this effort had an attrition rate of 8%, whereas the rest of the organization were at 13%. So it had a significant impact. Now, stay interviews are not just about retention. It can also help with other forms of data as well. So here's a couple of examples where they've used stay interviews, an interview early on in the employee's tenure with the organization, to really understand more about those employees and to gain additional insight. So at Baptist Healthcare, they ask upfront, how do you like to be rewarded? How do you like to be recognized? And they then share that insight with the line managers so that they've just got a bit more insight into that employee to help them think about future recognition plans. You know, maybe this person likes to be called out by their peers, or this person actually likes to be given the opportunity to go on a conference, or maybe this person actually just likes the flexibility just to be given the afternoon off if they've worked particularly hard over the previous week. Wipro do something similar, but they do it around problem solving and learning. So during the early days of the employee's tenure with the organization, they do a problem solving exercise. And this problem solving exercise is shared with the individual, but also the line manager. And what that helps the line manager do is to understand how they can really integrate them and onboard them into the organization effectively. So this person might learn through social interaction. So let's make sure they've got a buddy. This person might just like to be left to get on and learn and experiment for themselves. So I'm going to give this person a bit more autonomy. And this person actually needs a bit more supervision and hand-holding, particularly in the early days. Again, with Wipro, just this very simple approach of using a stay interview to really understand more about their people, they were able to reduce turnover by 33% in 6 months. Now, stay interviews are typically used for new employees, but these two organizations have expanded them to incorporate all their employees. At SRL Diagnostic, the interview ratio is about 60% of older employees to 40% of new employees, and they actually do them on a monthly basis. They're very short and sweet, but they are about just keeping in touch with what's key, why would you stay here? What matters to you? How can we improve your experience? Student Loan Hero, which is a financial services startup based in Texas, now they had zero turnover in their first 5 years, and they attribute this to their stay interviews. What they do is to have a stay interview with every employee at their anniversary. So you might want to start off with targeting, maybe retention risk or a particular group of employees with particular skills. You might then want to extend it to all new employees. And then if you really want to go for it, why not think about having stay interviews for all your employees? Now, one of the questions that comes up, or some of the questions that come up are, so how long should this be? When should we be doing it? And who does them? So we'd recommend about 20 minutes, short and sweet. It does not have to be a long, drawn-out interview with tons of questions. There's no right time to do a stay interview. What we would suggest is be guided by your data. So if you've got an issue with employees tending to leave within 90 days of joining your company, then do a stay interview as part of your onboarding process. Do they tend to leave around work anniversaries? If so, do your stay interviews around 90 to 120 days before employee anniversaries. Are you seeing a sudden increase of employee turnover? So you could do some stay interviews to learn why some people are staying and compare responses to those found on exit interviews to identify trends. So one of the questions that comes up obviously is who should do it, and typically we would look to HR to do this, but we would advise not. Of course HR has got a role in providing support for leaders and managers, training them on how to do it effectively, analyzing some of the data and trends that comes back, but ultimately this really needs to be owned by the manager. Here's an example of a company, Commonwealth Senior Living, and what they have got their managers doing this really well. They said it's so important that it's got to be between a line manager and an employee because they're the ones who can shape the experience that can help them to stay. What their HR director was saying is that perhaps one of the reasons that managers are nervous about asking these kind of questions at a stay interview about what's keeping you here and whether you want to go is that they often think it's going to be about money. But actually, the data that comes through with Commonwealth Senior Living, indeed through many, many organizations, is that it's very often not money. It's usually not money. It's simple operational hang-ups that they could so easily do something about. So what are the kind of questions that you should be asking in a stay interview? Well, there's no prescribed list, but I would suggest that you want to be asking 3 types of questions. What makes them want to stay? What would increase their commitment? And which triggers might cause them to leave? And there's some ways of asking this, you know. So under one, asking them what makes them want to stay, maybe talk about what are the reasons that you give to other people. So have you ever been asked by a close friend about why you want to stay at the organization or what made you want to come here in the first place? So get them to identify it that way. You could ask them about making them want to stay. You could ask them, you know, do you feel that you're currently doing the best work of your life? You know, if not, what would that look like? You could ask them, do you feel listened to and valued? So just kind of broaden the questions out rather than perhaps asking them a direct, what makes you want to stay here? In terms of questions that might increase loyalty and commitment, a useful way of getting that would be the if you managed yourself question. So if you managed yourself, what would you do differently in terms of managing you that I, as your current manager, am not doing? You can ask them, you know, if you were given the opportunity to redesign your current role, what would be the key factors that would make up your dream job? And then under triggers that might cause them to leave, which is often the slightly more uncomfortable one, a couple of ways of getting to that would be think back to a time in the last 12 months when you've been frustrated. So identify when you felt either anxious or frustrated in your role. So you're getting to these triggers in a slightly different way. Or you can always ask, what were the triggers that made you leave previous roles? Because there you can see whether there's any parallels to some of those frustrations or triggers that they'd experienced in a previous role that they might be experiencing today, which would give you an insight to do something about it. If you were going to start from scratch, maybe you could think about these 5 useful questions to get going with. So when you travel to work each day, what things do you look forward to? What are you learning here? Why do you stay here? When was the last time you thought about leaving our team and what prompted it? And finally, what can I do to make your experience at work better for you? So these things don't have to take a very long time. I wanted to just finish off by talking about a slightly different approach to stay interviews, one that Nestle took with their digital talent. Now, what they did was to have an underpinning assumption that the digital talent were going to be leaving. So they started the stay interview with, you know, we expect that you'll be thinking about leaving at some point in the next 12 months. What they found was that was a much better way of getting in that digital talent to open up. By assuming they were going to be leaving, it almost made it okay for the digital talent to talk about why they were going to be leaving and what were the factors that were encouraging them to look for another job. Interestingly, what came through very strongly was that a lot of digital talent at Nestle were looking to have their own startup. They wanted to do their own thing. They wanted more autonomy to get their own startup going on the side. And managers had actually been very restrictive around this and been saying no and putting up barriers to it. So what Nestle were able to do was to make it much more feasible for digital talent to get that startup going by looking at much more greater flexibility around working hours, much greater levels of autonomy. So just to sum up, you know, there are lots of ways that you can use stay interviews to have a positive impact on retention. You might want to use them for targeted groups such as digital talent or new joiners, or you might want to extend it to encompass the whole workforce. Think about how they can help you build greater insights, both about the individual but also your employment brand. And make sure it's a conversation between line managers and their people, not another HR process checklist. Give them support by providing them with a range of questions they might want to ask, and maybe invest in some training to help them understand how to do it more effectively. Thanks for listening, and good luck with your stay interviews.